Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty complex and honestly a place that's been in the headlines a lot lately, and that's the future of the Gaza Strip. Rebuilding efforts are underway, but it's not just about like putting up new buildings, right?
Oh, absolutely not. It's actually really interesting how rebuilding is already causing debate and raising some pretty big questions.
Yeah, for example, there's been this talk about just completely leveling what's left and starting over from scratch. Some are even using the word own, which is kind of a loaded term, in this context.
Definitely. It's a very different approach, and it makes you wonder what it all means for the people who actually live there.
Yeah, it's definitely stirred up strong reactions. Some are calling it a recipe for chaos, arguing that it ignores the suffering of the Palestinian people.
And that reaction really highlights the issue of self-determination for Palestinians. For many, this plan feels like someone else is dictating their future instead of letting them decide for themselves.
On the flip side, though, this proposal includes things like economic development, jobs, housing. It sounds like a total transformation.
Logistically, yeah, it would be huge. But will new buildings actually solve the root problems that have been causing conflict for so long?
And then there are the hostages, too. A heartbreaking situation that's become even more complex with all this talk about rebuilding. It's hard to say how any of these plans will impact their fate.
The hostages are a tragic reminder of the human cost of all this. Their safe return has to be the priority no matter what rebuilding plans are in place.
We're also seeing some pushback from major players in the region. Some are adamant that any progress with Israel depends on establishing a Palestinian state, which just adds another layer to everything.
It really highlights how divided everyone is on this issue. It's a reminder that it's so important to consider different viewpoints and what can happen when those viewpoints are ignored.
So we have this vision of a top-down rebuilding project focused on infrastructure and economics.
And on the other side are the concerns of the Palestinians who want to control their own destiny and are wary of any plan that feels imposed on them.
It's clear this is about way more than construction. It's about politics and social challenges.
Exactly. What's interesting is that both sides seem to agree that Gaza needs economic development, but the how and who, that's where the disagreements are.
One side seems to want more control over the process.
While others are pushing for a more grassroots approach, putting Palestinians in charge of their own resources. It's like two completely different blueprints for the future.
And then you have regional powers adding their own opinions and interests to the mix. It's like everyone is trying to get into the best position for what they think is the best outcome.
That's geopolitics in action. Every move has consequences, and the stakes are incredibly high. But in the middle of all of this, we can't forget about the people of Gaza who have been through so much. Their voices and needs have to be at the heart of any rebuilding effort.
For sure. It's their future we're talking about.
And that future isn't just about buildings. It's about the political and social systems that are put in place. That's what will really shape their lives.
There's a lot to unpack here. Maybe we need to step back and look at how Gaza got to this point.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Understanding the history is key to understanding what's happening now and what challenges lie ahead.
Because the past isn't just history. It's part of everything that's happening today.
Exactly. To understand why everyone is doing what they're doing, we need to look back at the events that have shaped Gaza's story.
Okay, let's go back and see how history has led us to this point.
So, for centuries, Gaza was this thriving trading hub, a real crossroads connecting different parts of the world. But things changed drastically in the 20th century, especially after Israel was created in 1948.
That's when tons of Palestinian refugees fled to Gaza trying to escape the fighting. It must have totally transformed the region.
Oh, absolutely. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians ended up in Gaza, which was under Egyptian control at the time. It created a massive humanitarian crisis and completely reshaped the social and demographic landscape.
So you had all these people suddenly crammed into a relatively small area. It's hard to imagine the impact.
Yeah. The strain on resources and infrastructure was enormous. And then in 1967, another major turning point, the Six-Day War, where Israel captured Gaza from Egypt.
And that was the start of the Israeli occupation that's still going on today.
Yes, although it's changed over time. There was a moment of hope in the 90s with the Oslo Accords. They were supposed to lead to a Palestinian state, including Gaza.
But that whole process fell apart and the underlying tensions never really went away.
Right. And then fast forward to 2005, Israel withdraws its settlements and military from Gaza.
I remember people saw that as a big step toward Palestinian autonomy.
It was a pivotal moment for sure, but Israel kept control of Gaza's borders, airspace, and coastal waters, which really limited Gaza's ability to be independent.
And then in 2006, Hamas win the elections in Gaza, which made things even more complicated.
Exactly. Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organization by Israel, and the U.S. took control of Gaza. This led to an Israeli blockade restricting the movement of people and goods in and out of the territory.
So Gaza basically became isolated politically and economically?
You could say that. And this isolation, combined with the conflict with Israel, has had a devastating impact on the people living there.
Like limited access to the basics. Clean water, electricity, healthcare. All those things most of us take for granted.
And limited chances for education and jobs. It's this terrible cycle of poverty, violence, and despair.
It's hard to think about. Sometimes with all the politics, it's easy to forget that real people are trying to survive under these conditions.
Their stories often get lost, but they need to be front and center in any rebuilding effort. Their well-being and their right to a decent life are what matters most.
So knowing all this history, how do we even start to rebuild Gaza in a way that really addresses these deep-rooted problems?
That's the question, isn't it? It's not just about new buildings. We need to deal with the root causes of the conflict, create a foundation for peace, and make sure it benefits the people who call Gaza home.
So what would that solution look like? Where do we even begin? Yeah, it feels like a huge problem. Where do we even start?
Well, it has to start with a real commitment to finding a political solution, one that works for both Israelis and Palestinians. That means talking about tough issues like a Palestinian state settlement security and the right of return for refugees.
Those are big issues with a lot of history and feelings involved. How do you even start to deal with those kinds of disagreements?
They're not easy conversations, but we can't just ignore them. We need everyone to be willing to compromise and find solutions that benefit both sides.
And what about the people in Gaza right now? The humanitarian crisis can't wait for a long-term political solution, can it?
No, you're right. We need to deal with the immediate situation, too. That means lifting the blockade so goods and people can move freely. That's essential for economic recovery and rebuilding important infrastructure.
So we need to think beyond just giving aid and rebuilding infrastructure. How do we help the people of Gaza build a future for themselves?
Yeah, it's not enough to just put a Band-Aid on things. We need to focus on long-term development and empowerment. That means things like education, healthcare, and jobs. It means letting local communities have a say in their own future.
So this is going to take a global effort. What can a country like the U.S. do?
The U.S. has a lot of influence in the region. It can really push for a fair and lasting peace. The key is to use that influence the right way.
But people say the U.S. is biased towards Israel. Can it really be a neutral player here?
I think that perception of bias is a problem, but it doesn't mean the U.S. can't do good. It needs to use its relationships to get both sides to the table and make sure any agreement is fair to everyone.
So the U.S. needs to be honest and work for a solution that benefits both Israelis and Palestinians.
Exactly. And it needs to work with other countries to support rebuilding and development in Gaza. It's a tough balancing act, but it's the only way to get lasting peace.
It's all about balance, isn't it? Recognizing the different perspectives and finding a solution that works for everybody.
Right. It's easy to oversimplify and see this as just good versus evil, but it's more complicated than that. Both sides have real grievances that need to be addressed.
We need to stop blaming each other and find common ground.
Exactly. And that means talking to everyone, even those we disagree with, even groups like Hamas.
That's a tough one for some people. They're a terrorist organization isn't talking to them a bad idea.
Shutting out key players will just make things worse. We need to talk to everyone, even if it's hard to agree. That's the only way to build trust, understand different perspectives, and find that common ground.
So it sounds like the road to peace in Gaza is long and difficult. Is there hope for a better future?
There's always hope. But hope is not just waiting for something to happen. It means taking action. It means we all need to do our part to build a more just and peaceful world.
So what can we as individuals do? This feels like a huge global problem.
It might feel overwhelming, but every little bit helps. It starts with being aware, learn about the situation, read different perspectives, and question your own assumptions.
Don't just rely on headlines and sound bites.
Right. Do your own research, ask questions, have real discussions, and speak up when you see injustice. Don't be afraid to stand up for peace. Your voice matters. Every voice that speaks for peace, for justice, for understanding, helps to drown out the hate and violence.
Be informed, be engaged, and promote peace.
Exactly. We're all connected. The future of Gaza, the future of the Middle East, it affects all of us. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to work for a better world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into rebuilding Gaza, it's obvious that this isn't just about construction. It's about people, about lost dreams, and the hope for a better future.
And the story isn't over yet. The choices we make today will decide what happens next. We all have a responsibility to work for peace, fight for justice, and create a world where everyone can live with dignity and security.
We've looked at the history, the different viewpoints, and the challenges ahead. But as we finish our conversation, I have one question for you. What does a just and lasting peace mean to you? What are you going to do to make it happen?